The second the army general whispered those words, my grandmother's funeral stopped feeling like a goodbye. It felt like the beginning of a mystery. When you get the chance, he said quietly, fly to Geneva. I frowned. He leaned in one last time. Give them your grandmother's name. They'll understand. Before I could ask another question, he turned around and walked away. I stood there in silence, watching him disappear among the rows of white headstones at Arlington National Cemetery. The funeral itself had been simple. Just me, a chaplain, an honor guard, and a few people standing quietly in the distance. My grandmother, Eleanor Hayes, had served as an army nurse during World War II. She passed away at 96. There were no famous medals hanging on her walls, no newspaper articles, almost no military records anyone could find. After the war, she lived in a small apartment. She volunteered at a free clinic after retirement. Whenever someone thanked her for serving, she smiled, then quickly changed the subject. She never liked talking about the war. For several days after the funeral, I convinced myself the general must have made a mistake. Maybe he had confused my grandmother with someone else. But no matter how hard I tried, his words wouldn't leave my mind. Curiosity refused to stay quiet. After returning home, I opened the old cedar chest that had sat at the foot of my grandmother's bed for as long as I could remember. Inside were neatly folded uniforms, old black and white photographs, letters tied together with faded ribbon, and several notebooks filled with her careful handwriting. At first, I thought they were personal journals. They weren't. They contained observations. Every page focused on helping people, emergency triage, preventing infections, keeping hospitals clean, finding better nutrition for recovering patients, organizing crowded field hospitals when supplies ran low. She almost never wrote about herself. She wrote about patients, doctors, nurses, and solutions. One sentence appeared again and again, sometimes written differently, but always carrying the same meaning. Good care begins long before treatment. The notebooks didn't feel emotional. They felt practical, as if she spent every day quietly solving problems instead of talking about them. I needed answers, so I contacted a military historian. I told him about the funeral, the general, and the strange message about Geneva. I scanned several notebook pages and sent them to him. Almost a week passed. Then my phone rang. His voice sounded different, careful, thoughtful. I don't think these are ordinary field notes, he said. I stayed silent. I believe your grandmother documented medical practices that were later shared internationally after the war. I blinked. What do you mean? I can't be certain, he replied. But if I'm right, you need to go to Geneva. That answer only created more questions. 1 month later, I boarded a flight to Switzerland. The building in Geneva wasn't grand. It wasn't covered with flags. It looked like any other international office. Quiet, professional, organized. I walked to the reception desk. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Hayes. The woman behind the counter paused. She looked at me, then at her computer. After several long seconds, she smiled warmly. Please have a seat. Without another word, she disappeared into another room. 10 minutes later, a man introduced himself as one of the archivists. He led me through a hallway into a reading room. Shelves of carefully preserved documents surrounded us. He looked at me kindly. We've been expecting that someday a member of your family would visit. I froze. I couldn't think of anything to say. He gently placed several archival folders on the table. Every folder carried my grandmother's name, not because she had commanded soldiers, not because she had won famous awards, but because she had recorded something incredibly valuable. During the final years of World War II, she worked alongside multinational medical teams. They compared how military hospitals cared for wounded soldiers in different parts of the world. Most reports focused on transportation, supplies, or military operations. My grandmother focused on people. She carefully documented how infections spread through crowded hospital wards. She recorded how proper nutrition helped patients recover faster. She explained how exhausted nurses adapted when medical supplies disappeared. She even described simple organizational changes that saved precious minutes during emergencies. Those observations didn't stay inside her notebooks. They were combined with reports from doctors and nurses from many different countries. Later, they became part of international discussions about humanitarian medical care after the war. The archivist carefully opened another folder. Inside were letters exchanged between senior physicians. Several praised my grandmother's reports. One handwritten note immediately caught my attention. Her observations are unusually practical. Preserve these for future reference. I read those words again and again. For my entire life, I wondered why my grandmother never seemed disappointed that almost no one knew what she had done. Standing there, I finally understood. She never measured success by recognition. She measured success by helping someone else. The archivist showed me additional documents, recommendations based on real wartime experience, including contributions from nurses, like my grandmother, helped improve emergency medical organization. They also influenced humanitarian healthcare guidance after the war. Her name wasn't printed across history books. It didn't have to be. Her ideas had become part of something much bigger than herself. Before I left, the archivist handed me certified copies of several preserved reports. He smiled. Your grandmother believed careful observation could save lives. Then he added quietly, history remembers many leaders. But sometimes, it quietly depends on people who simply paid attention. On the flight home, I couldn't stop thinking about the Army general. He never called my grandmother a hero. He never talked about medals. He never hinted at secret missions or hidden treasure. He only wanted one thing. He wanted her family to know the truth. When I returned home, I donated copies of her notebooks to a local museum. I also gave copies to the local historical society. I wanted people to learn about the thousands of military nurses whose work changed medicine without ever making headlines. Soon, neighbors began stopping by. For years, they had only known my grandmother as the quiet woman who baked pies for community events. Now, they wanted to hear her story. I answered every question, not because she needed recognition anymore, but because quiet service deserves to be remembered. Sometimes, I think back to one afternoon years before she passed away. We were planting flowers together in her tiny backyard. She smiled and said, "People think history changes because of the loudest voices." She gently pressed another flower into the soil. But most of the time, it changes because someone quietly keeps doing the right thing. Back then, I thought she was talking about gardening. Years later, standing in that quiet reading room in Geneva, with her life's work spread across the table, I realized something. She had been telling me the story of her own life all along.